Well, hello class, and welcome to the end of week 7. Believe it or not, we are about a week away from the end of the term, which is crazy to think about. Didn't we just start yesterday? I love that some of you write things like, hey, we made it through another week. We're almost there in your posts. That's great. Let me just, again, commend you, I want to say, for the great work that you have done this term. Lots of great thoughts, lots of great questions, lots of great insights. Conversations have been great. Just a really, I don't know, I think a wonderful, I have to say this is one of my favorite semesters or terms that I've taught of this class. I think that your contribution was really fantastic. And I can't say that that's always the case. So that's really, it's really just a blessing. I mean, I guess there's no other way to put it. I'm very grateful for what you've contributed to the overall learning process so far this term. I look forward to the last week. So we've looked at a lot. Last week, so week 6, we looked at cyber counseling. We looked at personality assessments like the Myers-Briggs. Some of you have said you've had some really great success with that. It's been meaningful for you, which is fantastic. Some of you may have taken the free assessment, maybe for the first time you've taken that. I think it's important that when we talk about the Myers-Briggs type indicator, we realize, we remember that it's not a test. I think I've mentioned that before. A test means that there's a right and wrong answer. And so if we refer to these assessments as tests, we are in some ways making some inferences to our clients that there is a right and a wrong answer. And if you don't get the right answer in quotes, then something is potentially wrong with you, right? So even I saw one of the comments that was made, and I love how it was communicated. And I know this wasn't the intention, but they were saying it was so great to watch the video by Susan Cain and read about, and I love how that was put in quotations, how a weakness can be a strength. And so my response was, also, when did having kind of introverted proclivities, right? So when we talk about introversion versus extroversion, you're not an introvert and you're not an extrovert. Your preference is more introverted, and your preference is more extroverted, right? So you have both an introverted side and an extroverted side. And for anybody and everybody, we prefer to be either more extroverted or more introverted. That's just how it is. I mean, some of you like to really spend time thinking up here. Maybe you could say you're more cerebral. You're kind of get lost in your thoughts. You process things. And you only speak when you have something that's really kind of you've been able to process it fully. So again, you like this, and this is where I think there's this neat connection with the cyber counseling, the online assessments, and even you talk about online education, and then with a preference towards introversion. This is a great environment because it allows for someone who is more introverted in their preference to spend time really thinking about what do they really think about the questions, and then processing internally, and then expressing what they think about those things, right? For extroverts, we just like to start talking. We open our mouths, and who knows what's going to come out. And we just start typing, and then, we can delete it, and we can just, but we don't really give it a lot of thought sometimes. At least I don't. I have to be very thoughtful and intentional and go to my more introversion side so that I am processing things internally before I actually execute or say the things that I want to say. But please hear me. Never is there a right or a wrong as far as introverted versus extroverted. There was this thought that to be a leader, you had to be an extrovert, right? That's not true. In fact, some of the best leaders, I would say, are introverts. So we need to kind of flip the script on that. When we're working with clients, some of you asked some questions about why do we continue to use these assessments if in some ways there lacks some validity or maybe even some significant research. So when you look at the Myers-Briggs type indicator step 1, which is what we talked about this last week, it's very kind of surfacey. But there's a step 2, and there's also a step 3. Step 2 and step 3 are much more kind of steeped in research and validity, and they give you, instead of a 2-page printout, a 17-page printout. It's actually very, very thorough, and I actually prefer to use step 2 when I'm working with clients versus that of step 1. I think it gives more. It's more expensive, but I think it is worth it. But the question of why do we keep using them is because it serves as a baseline. It serves as a conversation starter. You are much more, somebody even said this, we have to be careful that we don't allow our clients to think that they're defined, if you will, by an assessment. And that's true, that's right, that's good, that's important. We are much more than an assessment. But it does serve as somewhat, I would say, as a baseline and allows for us to have a conversation based upon the results. So I think there's great importance, but they're never gospel truth. We should never see them as such. We should never define them as such. We should never communicate them as such. They're just simply a tool to help us get to perhaps some deeper issues that are at hand that need to be talked about when it comes to career or other personality concerns within our client counseling relationship. Okay, so that's really important thing about this week. We looked at emerging adulthood and adulthood. I think these are really important topics, especially when you start to think about this 18 to 25-year-old time frame. We watched Meg J's video, which hopefully that provides some great insights. As a side, that was a video that actually a student shared in the artifact assignment that you did a couple of weeks ago. I had never seen the video before, and they found this video, and I said, oh, this is perfect. I have to use this in this week that we're going to look at. So in fact, I actually brought that into the course that very term, and have used it ever since. So some of the content that you shared in your artifacts may very well end up having the same thing happen in future classes that I teach coming down the pike. So, in addition to the video being a great video, it came from a student. So similar to many of you, that might be the case. What's interesting here, when you think about this emergent adulthood, which, it's a relatively, I say relative, but relatively new term or kind of ideology or understanding, is, and I think I've maybe said this before, but it's worth repeating, and I've said it to a lot of my undergraduate students, there's something unique and interesting and really kind of sideways, if you will, with this emergent adulthood 18 to 25 time frame. Okay, so before you turn 18, so all the way up until 17, right, day before 18, or something, it's an exaggeration, but you get the idea. There is no expectation that you have life figured out. Oh, it's great, perfect. And then you get 18, and between 18 and 25, there's all of a sudden this expectation that you need to have your whole life figured out, right? You need to know where you're going to go to college. You need to know what you're going to major. You need to know what your first job's going to be. When are you going to get married? When you have kids, your whole life has to be figured out. And then something unique happens again when you turn 25, and people are like, oh, you know what you're doing? Great. You got plenty of time. Don't worry about it. But in an emergent adulthood phase of life, there's this expectation, whether it's explicitly stated or implied, that we got to have our life figured out. And that's just simply not the case. I mean, you heard Dr. J talk about how our brain is not fully developed until we're 25 years old. So to put the expectation, and I think about it all the time with my undergrad students, for an 18-year-old to have their life figured out, I mean, it's a recipe for disaster. And so how do we come alongside young people and help them think through this content? That's a really important content. So one of the things that you saw, we actually skipped over a significant chunk of the book. And that was intentional because I'm operating off of an assumption, first of all, that the vast majority of your clientele with whom you'll be working are those that are going to be of an older kind of age group. Okay, so those that are going to be in emergent adulthood and older, so into adulthood. There's a slight chance that you'll be working with children, junior high, high school, but probably not, right? Probably going to be working with much more of an older clientele. One of our case studies that we looked at, I think it was last week, in fact, week 6, had to do with a school psychologist, right? So school counselor, and their kind of unhappiness with certain aspects of the job. A lot of you pulled out some great points in that, so it was wonderful. Your response was really great. So I was actually talking to a friend the other day, I think it was yesterday on campus, and we were talking about this class that I'm with you right now, learning and teaching, and was talking about how there are actually 3 courses on APU's campus that are specifically titled Career Development Theories and Techniques. Okay. One of them is for the college counseling, CCSE, College Counseling Student Development Program. One of them is for the Marriage and Family Therapy Program. And then the third one is for the School Counselor School Psychology Program. we are not obviously using the college counseling course or the school counseling course because the clientele with whom you specifically will be working with are very different. You may have some college students and you may have some K through 12 students. But like I said, probably not. And so that content, I've looked at the books, the content that they're teaching is very different. In fact, the first time I taught this class, I used a book by a Sharf. Sharf is the last name. And it was the same book that at the time college counseling was using. And I used it because it was familiar. I had researched it, looked at it. It was an okay book, but for our purposes for this class, it didn't actually work. But for college students, it was perfect. I looked at the K through 12 school counselor school psychology course, and that class that they teach is actually the book that they use is great for that clientele, for that age group. But for our age group, it's a very unique age group. So we have skipped over those chapters. I would encourage you to go read them. I think it's very valuable and important for you to know about it. But as far as what I need you to get at, I think that we're really starting from an age standpoint into the emerging adulthood and adulthood age group. Okay. So that's this week, an important week that we get at. Next week, we look at professional issues. And these professional issues, I'll tell you what, they continue to grow. I mean, even thinking back to earlier on in the term, we looked at the communitarian approach. And I actually, it's interesting, I was thinking about this as I was reading through your comments. It's really fascinating for me to think about where we have been historically, even as a student population in this class over the past 6.5, 7 years, and to see the response to even those questions, because I think there's a political shift, there's a climate that's changed a little bit, there's maybe more of an awareness to how we can maybe even interact with and serve those that are more maybe at risk or from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Those that don't have the same opportunities. So there's lots of different conversations that could be had, but it is interesting and quite fascinating actually to see the shift in response. I've had some very visceral responses to that chapter specifically since I've been teaching this class. But I saw a noticeable shift this term, which was very interesting to me. So I'm grateful once again for your contribution in that. But as we think about the continuing shift, and we think about work, and we think about what's the role even of the government as far as support, and we think about minimum wage, and there's those that are going to be on one side and say that there needs to be a minimum living wage, right? We need to have a $15 minimum wage. But then there's others that would say, but wait a second, from an economic kind of indicator standpoint, if you raise minimum wage that high, then of course everything else increases, which in many ways negates this pay increase where it went from $10.50 or $11 per hour to $15 per hour. And then there's this whole conversation on money. I can't remember the exact term that's used, but basically the government giving out a standard kind of living allowance to its people to support them, as opposed to kind of the free market capitalistic ways that we see. So there's all these conversations around work and where should we get support? Should the government be the one that does that? Should nonprofits be the one that do that? Should corporations be the one? Should individual kind of business owners? So when we think about this upcoming week, and we have lots of professional issues, lots of more research to be conducted, as well as ethical issues. And man, ethical issues are everywhere and so really sticky and challenging and important to think about. You think about more research. Some of you said, hey, why was there no discussion on spiritual well-being? We looked at the well-being text. Well, that wasn't the bent of the authors, but maybe there's more research to be conducted there. You think about ethics and all the ethics that you're looking at, professional ethics in your other courses. It's just the same here because so much is at stake. And you've asked questions of where does my career counselor role end and my marriage and family therapy counseling role begin, or vice versa. Those are conversations that you need to have both with your supervisors, with yourself, with your clients, and so forth. So lots happening. lots of really important content that I hope you see building on each other. Lots of great questions, lots of great insights. I'm going to post another video this weekend when I'm done grading your vocation and calling papers about what to expect in the final assignment. So watch for that probably sometime Sunday night, and I hope to have your grades inputted for this career and vocation and calling paper as well here in the next couple of days. Okay, so have a great weekend, and we will see you online.